If you have a scary story you'd like to see featured on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And as always, thank you. This experience is one that I've kept to myself for a very long time, and I've always wanted to put it out there, but I've always had this concern of people telling me I was lying or making it up. I will say that I am not making this up at all. It may sound like a crazy story, but it is something that happened to myself and my cousin when we were much younger. I'm not much of a writer, so if the story feels a bit stiff, I apologize, but I'll try my best to make this detailed and written well enough. This is the story of the night that my cousin and I believe we ran into the Jersey Devil out in the Pine Barrens. As I have said, I was spending time with my cousin back when I was about 20. While I was there, we had made plans to go on a camping trip as a way to wrap up our summer. As is only natural when you're in that part of New Jersey, I had told him that I wanted to spend a few nights in the Pine Barrens, an area notorious for those urban legends about how creepy the woods can be. We were fully aware of all the stories about the Jersey Devil, but being that age and with him having lived there, we all thought that it was just a joke or a story told to kids to keep us out of the woods. We got to our destination, a spot that was a bit secluded, far away from the other campers, and we settled in for the night. The first day was great. We did some hiking, cooked up our food over a small fire, and we turned in pretty early. The second day, we spent a lot of time out enjoying the weather, and we had broken out our case of beer so that we could party a bit over the campfire. That was, honestly, the overall plan of the trip. I was 20, my cousin was 22, so we planned on going out into the woods to get drunk and have a good time. That night, we started drinking and sitting around the fire, and my cousin started telling me about his plans for college, how he got a scholarship for whatever sport it was he played, and in the middle of his sentence, we both paused and looked out into the trees. The silence of the forest was broken by a strange sound, a high-pitched scream mixed in with a low, growling sound. When we both heard it, I mentioned that it was probably a wounded fox, that they make some really creepy sounds, and it was most likely just that. My cousin laughed and said that it was creepy as hell, and then we heard it again, except this time, the higher-pitched tone was less prominent and the growling was louder. I said that we should probably just go ahead and get to sleep. Part of me just wanted to ignore the sound and not think about it. My cousin agreed, and we got in the tents and went to sleep. After a bit, I did doze off, but I was woken up by that same sound again, probably about an hour or so later. I heard it and my eyes shot open like an instinctual reaction to the sound, like my body was telling me, hey, you need to wake up and be scared. I just stayed there on the sleeping bag for a few seconds, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, thinking about whether or not this thing was actually a threat, when I started hearing footsteps near the tents. I glanced over to where I thought they were coming from, and sure enough, there was something there. The steps were a bit heavy as this thing approached. I started to get hit with heavy fear when I saw a hand-like appendage start pressing against the fabric of the tent, almost like it was rubbing it, trying to figure out what it was. The fabric crinkled and folded slightly as this thing started pushing against the walls, and then the top. I just sat there thinking, it'll lose interest, it'll walk away. Thankfully, it did lose interest after a while, and it did start stepping away. At that point, though, I had to know what the hell that was, and when I was satisfied that it was a good distance away, I unzipped my tent to see if I could find this creature. To my surprise, My cousin was already standing outside of his tent, pale as a ghost under the moonlight. It was at that point that I realized that this wasn't just a normal creature, nor was it something I was imagining. He had seen it very clearly. I saw this thing too, but he saw it in much better detail. What I saw was a very tall beast-like thing covered in matted fur, and I swear that this thing had wings that were tucked in. My cousin added 2 details to this that make me think that this thing was the Jersey Devil. He said that it had glowing eyes that he saw as it walked away, and he claimed that it had legs with knees that shifted backwards like a goat. I can't make that claim as I didn't see its eyes, nor could I really see its legs in detail, but this thing was not a normal animal, that much I am certain of. Unfortunately, it was the middle of the night, and we were both a bit tipsy, so driving away wasn't a good idea. We both made a conscious decision to start our fire back up and just wait the night out, and then drive away when we were sobered up in the morning. When the sun came up, we got our stuff together and got the hell out of Dodge. To this day, I am convinced that what we encountered that night was the infamous Jersey Devil. I can't explain what it was or why it chose to check our little camp out like it did, but I'm grateful that it didn't go any further or decide that it wanted us and not just to check the tents out. I know that nothing really happened to us, thankfully, but it was still a scary moment. That was the only time we camped out in the Pine Barrens, and I will never forget that thing, whether it was the Jersey Devil or not. Alright, so this may get a bit long-winded, but as my first skinwalker encounter occurred nearly 2 decades ago, and seems to have set a certain tone for my life since then, and the most recent encounter happened in August of 2023, we have a good bit of ground to cover. So here we go. Back in the summer of 2005, I had just turned 20 and was already going through a divorce, the first of many stupid decisions I would make. Anyway, I needed some time to clear my head and ended up on a ranch my friend and his family owned in Montana. It was a wonderful spot, and I enjoyed my time there. But my encounter happened when we were checking on their flock of sheep. Earlier in the day, we had spotted an old native woman wandering the hills near the ranch, and as the sun had just went down, we went to deal with a coyote terrorizing the flock. My friend's father had emptied a double-barrel shotgun blast into the aforementioned predator, only for the animal to vanish after it fell. On our way back to the house, we found a coyote pelt with a newborn baby lamb wrapped inside it. 2 years later, I was back home in Missouri and going through a wild phase that, looking back on, was much darker than it had seemed at the time. In the moment, it felt very carefree and fun, but that's just an illusion, as in fact, I was in a spiral of addiction and a mental health crisis stemming from childhood trauma that was demanding to be addressed. I was staying on a friend's couch in a small town in Lawrence County, summer 2007. It was a rare night when I was completely sober, just playing Xbox, Need for Speed Blacklist, while my friend was working his closing shift at a nearby gas station. I was winning races, steadily grinding through the game, when I began to hear strange noises outside. We lived in a small one-bedroom house that sat near an apartment building. Our front door faced an alley you had to come down to get to our house. It sounded like I heard footsteps on the porch right outside the door, but it was far too early for my roommate to be home yet. Plus, I'd not heard his beast of a Suburban pull into the driveway either. I sat my controller down and moved towards the door slowly, leaning against it and listening. On the other side of the door, I could hear faint breathing. And then I heard my ex-wife's voice. Mind you, she lived in Indiana and had not spoken to me in 2 years, asking me to let her in. I just remember white hot rage start pounding through my veins. I knew it wasn't her, and the fact something was mimicking her voice to hurt me just triggered me. I was about to fling the door open and confront whoever or whatever was out there when I heard one of our neighbor's dogs come over its fence and start losing its mind. A vicious set of snarls and barks like I had never heard him make. Whatever was outside decided that discretion was indeed the better part of valor and fled. I heard the footsteps race away, and that was it. After my time in Lawrence County, I went to my uncle's farm in the middle of nowhere. I have a couple really creepy stories from there, not skinwalker related, but those are for another time, and kind of got my shit together. Once I went back to my parents' home in one of the larger cities in Missouri, I sporadically for years had occurrences similar to the one in Lawrence County. Footsteps outside, the voice of someone I knew, etc. In 2018, I had a girlfriend living with me, and both of us had instances where we'd be looking at the other laying in bed asleep while the sleeping person's voice would come from outside the window, usually saying something along the lines of, "Babe, come out here. I need your help." At one point, this was nearly a nightly occurrence. July of 2023, I was fresh back to my parents' house from 2 weeks on the East Coast. My girlfriend from the last encounter and I had just split up, and I was having horrible issues sleeping at night because of the PTSD dreams I was having. Another non-supernatural horror story for another time. So, one warm July night, I was stepping out my back door to have a cigarette in the driveway. I had a strange feeling in my gut, but made myself go outside anyway, 'cause I'm a grown-ass man, damn it, and you can't hide inside every time you feel uneasy. So, I step outside and immediately catch movement out of the corner of my left eye. I light my cig and turn my head and see a very large coyote dog thing standing 6 or so feet away from me. The creature, I swear, gives me a wise-ass little smirk, drops its eyes to the ground like it was saying, "Ah, yeah, you got me," then turns and struts its ass down the driveway. It gets to the street and glances back at me. This time, the look was one of pure malice, though. Then the thing took off so fast, I could barely perceive its movement. For the next month, every single night between the hours of 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., something would knock on my door and use my ex-girlfriend's voice, begging me to either let her in or to come outside and help her. It nearly drove me mad, but around the middle of August, it all just stopped, and it's not happened at all since the weather got colder. But then, the activity has always taken place in the summer. I can't think of a single time anything related to the skinwalker has happened that wasn't in the height of summer. It seems most active in July and early August. I hope you enjoyed my little tale. I have quite a few strange and creepy stories I could share, some supernatural, others not. I've always been a bit of a magnet for the supernatural. I'm an empath and descended from a long line of Cherokee shamans, so I suppose that's to be expected. I have a really weird and creepy story from when I was a kid, and I really don't know what it was I saw, but whatever it wasn't human. On top of that, I want to start the story with what I guess would be a trigger warning. This story is not a happy one, does not have a happy ending, and involves my childhood dog. If you choose to read this one, you should serve as a warning to your listeners if they can't stand things happening to dogs. It's recommended they skip this story. So, this story happened back when I was a kid. I believe that I was around 10 years old at the time, give or take a year. I'm in my 50s now, so it was a subjectively long time ago, to be honest. So, I'm sorry that I can't remember the exact year it happened. At this time, I lived with my parents, my big brother, and my pet dog, Aries. Aries was a small dog, smaller than a retriever, but bigger than a Shih Tzu. I don't remember what exactly he was, mostly because he was pretty much a mutt, but he was a good dog and he was very protective of me and my brother. When I say protective, I mean really protective. When my uncle came over, if he tried to give me or Brian a hug, Aries would bark and try to bite his leg. That was actually why we called him Aries. He was like a little warlord attacking anything that he didn't want near us. Now, where we lived wasn't heavily populated, but I can't say that it was completely desolate, just that there weren't many houses in the area. There were a lot of woods, however, and with the woods comes things like coyotes, foxes, and the like. I'd seen both in my few years alive, and I knew what they were, how they looked, what they sounded like when they cried. There were also claims of wolves and wild cats living in the woods near the house too, though I had never seen either. This may all sound like I'm just rambling, but I'm trying to show that I knew what all these things were, and if what I saw was one of them, I would have most likely been able to identify that creature. The first time I saw this thing was one day when I was playing outside after school. It was the middle of autumn, and the leaves were starting to turn color, and it was starting to get a bit colder. I was out back swinging a stick, pretending that I was a knight and battling for my made-up kingdom, when I heard what sounded like a person crying out behind my yard. It didn't sound like a child. It sounded like an adult was weeping out in the trees, like they wanted to sob but were controlling themselves and holding it in as best they could. I remember that this caught me off guard and my curiosity got the best of me. I needed to know why there was an adult out in the woods and why they were crying. I went over to the back of the fence and looked out into the woods, trying to see if I could find the person that was crying. At first, I couldn't see anything, but after kind of glancing around the trees, I noticed that there was what looked like a man standing out in the woods near the trees, and I remember chuckling to myself because he looked like he was naked. Again, I was like 9 or 10, so it was just funny to me that this person was standing naked out in the woods like that, but as I kept staring, something about him felt wrong. He looked like he was too skinny to be alive, really. Like his skin was the only thing blocking his skeleton from the wind, and as quickly as I thought it was funny, I started feeling a bit scared. It was at this point that Aries started growling and barking at the person, and as soon as he did, this thing turned around to look at me, and I will never forget its face. It was flat, like there was no nose, and his eyes were dark black. His mouth looked larger than a normal person's, and it looked like he had fangs, like sharp and cut teeth. I could see all this from where I was standing, and he wasn't near me. That should tell you how much of an impact that visual had on me. I freaked out and immediately ran back to the house. Aries followed me but was also stopping and barking at the back of the yard every few steps, but after a few moments he ran with me back to the house. I had no idea what to really do with this event, so I just kind of sat in my room and had what I now know to be a panic attack. This thing was terrifying. It looked human, but it definitely wasn't. And it wasn't any of the aforementioned creatures. I remember my brother coming into my room and asking if I was okay, because he said he could hear me crying from his room, which was a surprise to me because I wasn't even aware that I was crying. I told him that I saw something in the woods that scared me, and when I tried to explain what it was, he said it was weird, but that it wasn't a big deal, and that it was probably just a sick animal. He was older than me, so I assumed he was probably right, but deep down, I knew that was wrong. Now, if that was the only time I ever saw this thing, it would have been one too many times. But it wasn't. And the next time I saw it is where things got worse. I want to add again that this second time is the disturbing event that I mentioned earlier, and this is your fair warning that things did not end well. The second time I saw it was about a week later. I was out back again, just sitting on my slide and staring out into the woods. After I saw that thing, I was actually scared to do much outside, but my parents were the type to tell me to go play outside all the time, so I would pretty much just sit there and stare out into the woods, seeing if this thing would come back. Unfortunately, it did, and this time it was closer. I was watching the trees, and I noticed that this thing was standing out in the woods and basically crawling on its knuckles. This time, in a moment of stupidity and bravery, I actually shouted toward it, telling it to go away. I don't know if I thought that this thing would understand me or what, but I did it. When I shouted, this thing turned to face me, and it started to do its weird crawl, walk motion in my direction toward the fence. Unfortunately, this was enough for Aries to freak out. He actually ran toward the fence and dug out the small spot in the corner and went under the fence out into the woods, barking aggressively and chasing this thing. This creature did start running, I guess, further into the woods, but Aries was unrelenting and kept chasing him. I started shouting for him, but he completely ignored me. I ran back to the house and I shouted for my dad, saying that Aries got out and was chasing something into the woods. I wanted to tell him that it was some monster, some human-like beast, but the only word I could get out was something. I won't bore you with the conversation and how we went out to call for him beyond saying that my dad jumped the fence and went out into the woods looking for him while I stayed in the fence. After a while, he told me to go inside and get my mom and to stay inside until they came back, which I did. I later found out that the reason he told me to get my mom and stay inside was because he did find Aries, but what he found wasn't pleasant. They both explained to me that Aries was unfortunately gone, and they had to explain that things like this happen sometimes. I tried to explain what the thing was that I saw, but they basically told me that it was likely something like a wolf that had gotten to him. I was insistent, but they dismissed it and just told me that they would bury him out in the woods and that it would be okay. Obviously, I was devastated. Aries was a good boy, and he just wanted to protect me, and whatever the hell this monster was had killed him. That was actually the last time that I saw this thing, and unfortunately, my family just accepts that it was probably a wolf or something, and Aries just wasn't big enough to hold his own. But I know that's wrong. I know this thing was some sort of humanoid monster, not a wolf. I hate that this whole thing was probably my fault. If I hadn't shouted at it, it probably wouldn't have started approaching, and Aries probably wouldn't have went after it. But I know I can't blame myself. Aries was trying to protect me from this thing, and he did his job, as it never did come back. I will always love and honor that pup as being the guardian he was. And I will never forget what that thing was that I saw. That horrifying face and disgusting frame that this thing had as it approached me that day. Some encounters in life are so extraordinary that they become sharply etched into your memory, completely refusing to fade away, no matter how much time passes. I had one of these encounters, one of these interactions with what I think was a cryptid of some sort. I cannot explain what the hell I saw, other than to say it was a creature straight out of my wildest imaginations, and the whole thing was incredibly chilling for me. I grew up in a rural town in Vermont. The endless expanse of woods was my playground for most of my youth. I was always on an adventure, pretending to be the first person to have ever ventured into the middle of nowhere. For me, the trees always held untold stories for my young brain. However, the day of this encounter, my view of the woods was completely shifted. This evening, it was starting to get dark, and the sky was turning to a really pretty orange, and it was about to be time for me to head back home, so I was starting to head back towards the house. I had my flashlight with me, but I also didn't want to be out there when it had gotten too dark, so I was heading mostly in the direction of my home, but was still pretending that I was an adventurer and heading back to camp. About halfway through the trail back to my home, I heard what sounded a bit like a rustling in the underbrush. My first thought was squirrel or fox or something like that. It wasn't too terribly uncommon to run into something like that in the early evening, so I dismissed it at first. But then I started hearing what sounded like heavy steps in the leaves. The rustling went from soft to hard stomps, as whatever was out there was walking a bit out in the woods. At this point, my mind went to the possibility of a bear. I didn't think it would be likely considering my location and the time, but it wasn't impossible. Then I started hearing this low, guttural growl that sent the sharpest chill down my spine, and from there, I knew that this was not a normal forest inhabitant. I kept walking towards the house, but would frequently turn to look back into the woods, looking for the location of this thing. I paused for a moment and shined my flashlight out into the trees to see if I could get a glimpse of whatever this thing was. My heart nearly stopped when my small light illuminated this creature. This monster was unlike anything I have ever seen or heard. It was massive, at least 6 feet tall, hunched over behind a tree. It had fur that was thick, but there were spots that looked like they were missing patches, and where the patches were missing, the skin looked irritated and almost damaged. At first, I thought it was actually a bear, albeit injured or sick, but I noticed that it was digging at the ground with a bit of aggression, like it was trying to get at something, and its hands weren't like any other creature I would expect to see. They were almost human-like, with normal-looking fingers. It didn't even have claws. It just had long, human-like fingers that were digging into the dirt. That's what really set it aside as something other than a bear for me. I froze as I watched this thing tear into the ground. This thing was paying me no attention, much to my surprise, and I knew that I needed to run, but I honestly couldn't, until I watched this thing stand up and glance in my direction. It pulled itself up onto its feet, turning away from whatever it was digging at, and I swear it sniffed the air in my direction like it was trying to identify what I was. As soon as I saw this, I took off back toward the house as fast as I humanly could. I swear, I could have set a new speed record with how quickly I ran from that spot to my front door, and when I finally got to the porch, I stopped for a second to take a breath. When I did, I looked around to see if this thing was following me, but it wasn't. I ran in and I locked the door as quickly as I could, and then stared out the window to see if I could see this thing outside. But again, I couldn't. I had no idea where this thing had gone, but I was glad to see that it hadn't followed me home. I have no earthly idea what that thing was, but I can tell you with certainty that it was not something that normally occurred in the woods of Vermont. It wasn't an injured bear, based on the hands and how it held itself, and it wasn't some kind of wolf or dog or anything based solely on how large it was. Even now, I have no explanation for what I encountered that evening. Was this some kind of cryptid or something like a dogman? I don't know, but it scared the absolute hell out of me. I never ventured out that far into the woods after that day, and I no longer live in Vermont, so I have no idea if that thing is still out there. I'm glad I was able to get out of there unscathed, but I can only imagine what would have happened if that thing had been more interested in me than in the hole it was digging. So that, my friends, was a collection of scary cryptid stories. Stories where, for once, it's not human beings that are creeping us out. But unfortunately, the problem with that is that we can't just look at them and judge them because they don't care. They'll just continue to terrorize us. So all we can do is stare and cry, or submit the stories and tell other people online. And for that, thank you for sharing. So if you did like these stories, please do give it a like below. I'd appreciate that. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. I would also appreciate that. And you can also leave a comment with your thoughts, or let me know, are you getting... My cat's going crazy, sorry. Are you getting crazy rain storms too? Let me know. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. And until next time, take care.